The seat she paid for, a story of resilience and change. The airport bustled with the usual chaos of travelers dragging suitcases, last-minute announcements blaring over the intercom, and the rhythmic beeping of security scanners. Among the crowd, Aaliyah Carter walked confidently towards the first-class check-in counter, her polished leather heels clicking against the marble floor. She was dressed sharply in a tailored navy blue blazer and a crisp white blouse, her natural curls cascading down her back. At just 22, she carried herself with the grace and poise of someone who belonged in elite spaces. And she did, her ticket proved it. She reached the counter and handed over her boarding pass, offering a polite smile to the airline employee. The woman behind the desk, whose name tag read Whitman, barely glanced at the ticket before looking up and giving Aaliyah a slow, scrutinizing once-over. A brief silence. A flicker of something in Whitman's eyes, judgment? Suspicion? "I'm sorry, miss," she said, her tone clipped and professional, but there was an undeniable edge to it. "This line is for first-class passengers only." Aaliyah kept her smile. "I know," she said calmly, tapping the ticket. "That's why I'm here." Whitman took the boarding pass hesitantly, scanning it as if she expected it to be fake. Her eyes darted between Aaliyah and the screen, then back to the ticket. A beat passed, and then another. "I see," Whitman finally said, setting the ticket down. "Miss Carter, could you step aside for a moment?" Aaliyah's brows furrowed. "Why?" Whitman's smile didn't reach her eyes. "We just need to verify something. Please, step aside." Behind her, the line of passengers grew restless. A man in a gray suit cleared his throat, shifting his briefcase from one hand to the other. A couple of few spots back whispered to each other, their eyes darting between Aaliyah and the counter. Aaliyah glanced at the screen. Her ticket had already been confirmed. There was no reason for this. Her voice remained composed, but there was an unmistakable firmness in it. "Is there a problem with my ticket?" Whitman hesitated. "It's just, these seats are quite expensive. We like to ensure that." "That what?" Aaliyah interrupted, her patience wearing thin. Whitman faltered, but only for a second. Then she squared her shoulders, her expression cool and dismissive. "We reserve the right to perform additional verification when necessary." Aaliyah exhaled slowly. She had seen this before. Not outright refusal, no, that would be too obvious. Just enough inconvenience to make someone feel out of place. Just enough to make them question if they truly belonged. Before she could respond, a voice from behind her cut through the tension. "Excuse me," a young boy piped up. "She was in line before us." Aaliyah turned slightly, seeing a small blonde-haired boy tugging at his mother's sleeve. His mother, dressed in pearls and a tailored cashmere sweater, barely glanced at Aaliyah before giving her son a tight smile. "It's fine, Henry," she said dismissively, squeezing his shoulder. "Some people just get confused about where they're supposed to be." Aaliyah's jaw tightened. Confused. Whitman was already moving on, turning to the next passenger in line as if Aaliyah had simply disappeared. "I can seat you in economy," she said, picking up the ticket again. "There's space available there." Aaliyah stared at her. "I didn't book economy." "I understand," Whitman said, though she clearly didn't. "But it's a full flight. I can put you on standby if you'd like to wait for another seat." Aaliyah had two choices. She could push back, demand to be seated where she paid to sit. But she already knew how that would go. Security would be called, voices would be hushed, eyes would watch as she was escorted away. It was a routine she had seen before. Instead, she did something else. She smiled. Not a warm, friendly smile. A knowing one. The kind that carried power. "You're making a big mistake," she said softly. Whitman barely reacted. "Would you like me to process the economy seat?" Aaliyah took her boarding pass back, tucking it into her designer purse. Then, without another word, she turned and walked towards the economy boarding gate. The mistake, she knew, wasn't hers. It was Whitman's. And soon, she'd realize just how big it was. The hum of the airplane cabin filled the space as passengers settled into their seats, the overhead compartments clicking shut one by one. Aaliyah moved through the narrow aisle, her boarding pass still gripped tightly in her hand. The sting of humiliation lingered, but she refused to let it show. Instead, she walked with the same quiet confidence that had carried her through countless moments like this. Reaching her assigned seat in economy, she exhaled slowly, forcing herself to let go of the frustration. The plush, oversized seats of first class weren't what defined her. It wasn't about luxury, it was about respect. And right now, that was the one thing she had been denied. As she slid into her seat, she noticed a familiar face a few rows ahead. The little blonde-haired boy from the check-in line, Henry, sat comfortably in a spacious first-class seat, his small legs swinging over the edge. His mother sat beside him, engrossed in flipping through a glossy magazine. Henry turned, catching sight of Aaliyah in the economy section. His brows furrowed in confusion. "Mom," he whispered, tugging at his mother's sleeve. "She's supposed to be up here with us, right?" His mother barely looked up from her magazine, adjusting her pearl necklace as she spoke. "Don't worry about it, honey," she said dismissively. "She must have made a mistake." Aaliyah didn't react. She had learned long ago that people like Henry's mother didn't see their words as insults, they saw them as facts. The plane continued to board, and soon, a familiar figure moved through the first-class cabin. Whitman. The woman who had denied Aaliyah her rightful seat now strolled the aisles of first class with a trained smile, checking on passengers and ensuring they were comfortable. Aaliyah watched as she leaned down to speak with an older black man seated in first class. He wore a dark suit, his hands resting on a leather briefcase. His demeanor was professional, composed, just like hers. But Aaliyah didn't miss the way Whitman's posture stiffened as she asked to see his ticket again. The man frowned slightly, pulling the ticket from his coat pocket. "Is there a problem?" "Just a routine verification," Whitman said smoothly. "Thank you for your cooperation." Aaliyah's fingers curled into fists. Routine verification. The same excuse she had been given. No one else in first class was being routinely verified. She reached into her bag, pulling out her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before she started typing a message. "Dad, you need to know what's happening on your airline." She hit send. The plane took off, the engines roaring as they climbed higher into the clouds. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, passing out drinks and pillows to first-class passengers. Aaliyah, feeling restless, decided to test something. She pressed the call button. A moment later, a flight attendant appeared. It wasn't Whitman, but another woman in uniform, polite and professional. "Yes, ma'am? Could I have a pillow, please?" Aaliyah asked. The flight attendant smiled warmly. "Oh, of course. Let me bring you one." But before she could leave, Whitman suddenly appeared beside her, her expression tightening. "I'm sorry," Whitman said before the flight attendant could retrieve the pillow. "Pillows are reserved for first-class passengers." Aaliyah met her gaze evenly. "That's interesting. Because the gentleman up front just received two." Whitman hesitated, then forced a tight smile. "That must have been a mistake." Aaliyah nodded slowly. "Yes," she said, voice steady. "A mistake." Before Whitman could respond, a small voice interrupted. "That's not fair." It was Henry. The little boy had turned in his seat, looking straight at Whitman. "She's first class too. I saw her in line. Why are you treating her different?" Whitman's mouth opened and closed, her face growing red. Henry's mother quickly reached for his arm, tugging him back into his seat. "Henry, that's enough," she said sharply. "Mind your own business." "But it's not fair," Henry insisted, his small face scrunching in frustration. "She should be up here." Aaliyah felt a strange mix of emotions, gratitude, sadness, frustration. This child saw what the adults refused to acknowledge. She gave him a small smile before turning her gaze back to Whitman. "This isn't over," she said quietly. Whitman blinked, thrown off by the confidence in her voice. Aaliyah leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes briefly. She knew her father well enough to know one thing. By the time they landed, this flight would no longer belong to Whitman. The plane cruised at 35,000 feet, the seatbelt sign flickering off as passengers settled into their routines. Some scrolled through their tablets, others leaned back for a mid-flight nap. The soft hum of the engines filled the cabin, blending with the quiet murmur of conversation. Aaliyah sat still, her gaze fixed out the window at the endless stretch of clouds below. Her phone rested on her lap, the message she had sent to her father now marked as read. She knew better than to expect an immediate response. James Carter never reacted, he responded. And when he did, it was always with precision. Across the aisle, Whitman continued her rounds, chatting effortlessly with first-class passengers, flashing a polite, rehearsed smile. To her, this was just another flight. Just another day of enforcing the invisible barriers that told people where they did, or didn't, belong. But today would not end like any other day. Aaliyah closed her eyes briefly, centering herself. This wasn't just about her. A tap on her arm broke her thoughts. She turned to see Henry standing in the aisle beside her seat. His mother was still nose-deep in her magazine, oblivious to her son's movement. "I told my mom you were supposed to be up front," he whispered. His small face was scrunched with concern. "She said people just get mixed up sometimes, but I saw your ticket." Aaliyah softened, offering a small smile. "Thank you, Henry. That was very kind of you." Henry hesitated, then asked, "Is it because you're—" He stopped, fumbling for words, looking uncomfortable. Aaliyah knew where that sentence was going. She let out a quiet breath. Sometimes, people assume things about others before they even get to know them. Henry frowned, thinking, "Like how my teacher always says I can't sit still, but I really just get excited." She chuckled. "Something like that." Before he could respond, a voice interrupted. "Henry." His mother's tone was sharp, cutting through the air like a whip. The boy flinched. "Come sit down." "Now," she ordered, eyes flicking to Aaliyah with a warning glare. Henry hesitated, then gave Aaliyah a quick nod before returning to his seat. Aaliyah sighed, watching as his mother whispered something in his ear, her expression tight with disapproval. She didn't have time to dwell on it. Her phone vibrated in her lap. A message. "Dad, what gate are you arriving at?" Her heartbeat quickened. She texted back the details, then slipped her phone back into her purse. It was time. The final hour of the flight passed uneventfully, but there was a shift in the air, an undercurrent of change Aaliyah could feel in her bones. She sat quietly, waiting, as the plane began its descent. The moment the wheels touched the runway, she unbuckled her seatbelt, exhaling slowly. She wasn't in a hurry. There was no need to rush. She could already feel it coming. The cabin doors swung open, and passengers began to file out. Aaliyah waited, standing calmly as the crowd thinned. She could see Whitman at the front, her back straight, her posture confident. The woman had no idea what was waiting for her just beyond the gate. Aaliyah stepped forward. And then she saw him. James Carter. He stood just past the terminal doors, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, his hands resting casually in his pockets. His expression was unreadable, but his presence was undeniable. The energy in the air shifted. Whitman, still oblivious, turned to greet the disembarking first-class passengers with her usual empty pleasantries. Then she saw him. She froze. James Carter's gaze flickered toward her, sharp and assessing. Whitman's entire posture changed, shoulders stiff, lips pressed together in a thin line. She knew. But it was too late. Aaliyah walked past her without a word, heading straight toward her father. When she reached him, he didn't say a thing. He simply extended his hand, his palm warm and steady as she took it. Then, with a small nod, he turned his gaze toward Whitman. Her face was pale now, her professional confidence shattered. "Miss Carter," James said, his voice smooth but firm, "I believe we have something to discuss." Whitman swallowed hard. Passengers around them slowed, sensing that something big was happening. Even Henry, still holding his mother's hand, was craning his neck to see. Aaliyah remained silent. She didn't need to say anything. Her father had arrived, and justice was about to begin. The terminal buzzed with the usual sounds of an airport: rolling suitcases, muffled announcements, hurried footsteps. But in the center of the first-class gate, there was an unmistakable shift in energy. James Carter stood tall, his sharp eyes locked onto Whitman, whose once confident posture now wavered. The artificial smile she had worn throughout the flight was gone. In its place was a mask of forced composure, but Aaliyah could see the unease creeping into her eyes. A few passengers slowed their pace, drawn to the unspoken tension. Henry, still holding his mother's hand, peeked up curiously. His mother, sensing something serious, gently nudged him forward, urging him to keep walking. But he looked back at Aaliyah one last time before disappearing into the crowd. Aaliyah didn't move, nor did she speak. She didn't have to. This moment wasn't hers to handle anymore. Her father took a single step forward. "Ms. Whitman." His voice was smooth, steady, almost casual. But there was weight behind it. Whitman straightened, desperately trying to regain control. "Yes, Mr. Carter?" James tilted his head slightly. "I understand there was an incident on this flight involving my daughter." Aaliyah watched as Whitman's throat bobbed in a nervous swallow. "There must have been a misunderstanding," Whitman said quickly, her voice almost too polite. "We have procedures in place to ensure first-class seating is properly assigned. It was simply a mistake?" James finished for her. His tone hadn't changed, but something about the way he said it made Whitman pause. "Yes, sir," she said, nodding quickly, relief flashing in her eyes as if she thought the situation might be smoothing over. James let the silence stretch between them for a moment. Then, in that same steady voice, he asked, "Tell me, Ms. Whitman, how many mistakes like this do you make in a week?" Whitman's lips parted slightly, caught off guard. James continued, his gaze never wavering. "How often do you mistakenly assume that a black woman doesn't belong in first class?" The air shifted. Whitman's face flushed, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for an answer. I assure you, Mr. Carter, we follow standard verification processes," she stammered. James arched a brow. "Did you verify every passenger in first class, or just my daughter?" Whitman said nothing. "Right," James murmured, his lips pressing into a thin line. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, James reached into the pocket of his suit and pulled out a sleek leather wallet. He flipped it open, revealing a black and gold executive ID badge. The logo of the airline gleamed under the fluorescent terminal lights. A few gasps rippled through the crowd as realization dawned. James Carter wasn't just any passenger. He was the owner. Whitman's breath hitched. James exhaled slowly, as if disappointed rather than angry. "Ms. Whitman, I have spent years building this airline into one of the most trusted, customer-first businesses in the industry. We do not tolerate discrimination. Not in hiring. Not in customer service. Not anywhere." I didn't." "You did," James cut in, his voice as firm as steel. Aaliyah watched as the weight of his words pressed down on Whitman. The woman who had been so dismissive, so sure of her authority, now stood small in front of the very man whose company she worked for. "Effective immediately, you are suspended pending a full investigation," James stated. "Someone from HR will be in touch with you shortly." Whitman's face turned pale. "Suspended?" James gave a sharp nod. "While we determine whether you still have a future with this airline." Whitman opened her mouth as if to protest, but she seemed to think better of it. Her shoulders slumped. For the first time, she looked defeated. Aaliyah had thought she might feel vindicated seeing this moment unfold. But as she looked at Whitman's face, she felt something else, something quieter. It wasn't just about getting back at this one woman. It was about making sure it didn't happen again. As Whitman turned away, a hush fell over the remaining onlookers. The moment had passed, but the message was loud and clear. James turned to Aaliyah, his expression softening. "Are you all right?" She nodded, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I am now." Her father placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Good." Aaliyah glanced around, noticing a few flight attendants standing nearby, each one watching. Some looked nervous, some looked relieved. And then there were the passengers, some who had seen what happened, others who had only heard about it. Henry was gone, but Aaliyah had a feeling he would remember this moment, even if his mother tried to make him forget. She adjusted the strap of her bag and turned toward the exit with her father by her side. As they walked, James spoke again, his voice low. "Would you like your seat back on the return flight?" Aaliyah smirked. "First class?" "Of course." She considered it for a moment, then shook her head. "No," she said. "I think I'll stay in economy." Her father gave her a curious look. She smiled. "Because next time this happens, I want to be there. I want to see it. And I want to make sure the next girl like me doesn't have to fight this battle alone." James studied her for a moment, then nodded in approval. "That," he said, "is exactly why I'm proud of you." As they disappeared into the crowd, Aaliyah knew one thing for sure: this was only the beginning. The airport doors slid open, and a rush of warm air greeted Aaliyah as she stepped outside with her father. The city hummed around them, car horns, distant chatter, the rhythmic footsteps of travelers weaving in and out of the terminal. James Carter signaled for a driver waiting at the curb, but Aaliyah lingered, her gaze drifting back toward the terminal. The weight of what had just happened still settled in her chest, not heavy, but present. She exhaled. "That felt different," she admitted. Her father glanced at her as the driver stepped out to open the car door. "Different how?" Aaliyah hesitated. "I mean, I've dealt with situations like this before. People making assumptions. But I've never seen it handled like that." James nodded thoughtfully. "Because most of the time, people like Whitman don't have to answer for what they do. They get to brush it off. Pretend it never happened." He paused. "Not this time." Aaliyah crossed her arms, shifting her weight. "But will it actually change anything? I mean, she got suspended, but will that stop the next Whitman from doing the same thing to someone else?" James studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, instead of answering, he gestured toward the car. "Come on. Let's go." Aaliyah slid inside, the plush leather seats cool beneath her fingertips. The city blurred past the tinted windows as they pulled away from the airport. Her father sat beside her, silent at first. Then, he reached into his pocket and handed her a sleek black folder. "What's this?" she asked, flipping it open. Inside were documents, formal, professional-looking. Her eyes scanned the heading. Equity and Inclusion Task Force, Executive Initiative. She blinked, glancing up. "What is this?" James leaned back against the seat, his fingers interlaced. "An expansion of an existing program. We already have initiatives in place to ensure fair hiring practices, but what happened today?" He shook his head. "That tells me we need to go further. Not just behind the scenes, but where the customers see it, feel it." Aaliyah flipped through the pages. It wasn't just corporate policies, it was about training, real accountability. "You want me to be a part of this?" she asked. James gave a small smile. "Who else?" She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "So I go from being denied a seat to, what? Fixing the entire industry?" "You don't have to fix it," James said. "You just have to start the conversation. The rest will follow." Aaliyah stared at the papers in her lap. The weight in her chest shifted, no longer frustration, but purpose. "All right," she murmured, nodding. "I'm in." James nodded, satisfied. She exhaled and leaned back against the seat, watching the skyline grow closer. For the first time in a long time, she didn't just feel like she belonged. She felt like she had power. And this time, she was going to use it. A few days later, Aaliyah found herself standing in a sleek conference room overlooking the city skyline. The floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the space in soft afternoon light, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany table. Across from her, a group of executives from her father's airline sat with attentive expressions, their neatly pressed suits and expensive watches a silent testament to their influence. This was not where she had expected to be. A week ago, she had been just another passenger, one among thousands who flew every day, following the rules, trusting the system. And yet, within moments of stepping into that airport, she had been reduced to a question mark in someone else's mind. Does she belong here? Today, there would be no questions. James Carter sat at the head of the table, flipping through a file. He finally set it down, his sharp gaze sweeping across the room. "Let's begin." Aaliyah took a breath. She wasn't a corporate executive. She wasn't a policy expert. But she was someone who had lived the reality they were discussing. That made her the most qualified person in the room. "I'd like to start by asking something simple," she said, glancing at the faces around the table. "How many of you have ever been told you don't belong somewhere?" Silence. A few exchanged glances. One man cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Ever had someone question whether you actually paid for your seat? Been asked to verify something no one else had to?" More silence. "Right," she said, nodding. "That's what I thought." She placed both hands on the table and leaned slightly forward. "This isn't just about one bad employee making a mistake," she continued. "It's about a culture, one that makes people like me have to prove, over and over again, that we belong. That's not a mistake. That's a pattern." James, sitting beside her, didn't say a word. He didn't need to. This was her fight. One of the executives, a woman in her 50s with a pearl necklace, folded her hands on the table. "Miss Carter, we don't tolerate discrimination in our airline. We have policies in place." "Policies aren't enough," Aaliyah interrupted smoothly. Whitman knew the policies. She followed procedure. But procedure doesn't stop bias when someone already believes they know who belongs and who doesn't. Another executive, a younger man with slick back hair, frowned. "Are you saying we need to completely overhaul our employee training?" Aaliyah met his gaze head on. "I'm saying you need to rethink the entire experience. From hiring to customer service to how complaints are handled. Because trust me, for every person who reports something like this, 10 more stay silent." The older woman sighed. "What exactly are you proposing?" Aaliyah pulled a folder from her bag and slid it across the table. "A new initiative. Real training, real consequences, real accountability. You don't just teach employees to be polite. You teach them to recognize their own biases and what to do about them." The executives flipped through the proposal. Some nodded. Some frowned. One whispered something to another. James finally spoke. "We're implementing this. Non-negotiable." The murmuring stopped. "Any objections?" Silence. Aaliyah watched as realization settled across the table. This wasn't just a conversation. This was change happening in real time. Finally, the younger executive nodded slowly. "All right. Let's make it happen." Aaliyah sat back, exhaling quietly. She had walked into this room as a passenger. She was leaving as someone who had rewritten the rules. And she wasn't done yet. Aaliyah stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the conference room, looking out over the city skyline. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting golden light over the glass buildings that towered over the streets below. Conversations continued behind her, the murmurs of executives shuffling papers, the quiet hum of a new plan being put into motion. She had done it. But it still didn't feel like enough. She turned back to see her father shaking hands with one of the board members. The meeting was wrapping up, the decision made. The Equity and Inclusion Task Force was no longer just an idea, it was real, set to roll out in the coming months. Employees at every level, from check-in agents to flight attendants to senior leadership, would undergo real training on bias and discrimination. And for the first time, customer complaints about unfair treatment wouldn't just be dismissed, they would be tracked and investigated. Progress. And yet, a nagging thought remained in her mind. She walked over to where her father stood, waiting as the other executives exited the room. When they were alone, she folded her arms and gave him a knowing look. "This is a good start," she said carefully. "But you and I both know policies don't change people." James nodded slowly. "You're right. Policies set expectations, but they don't fix what's already inside someone's head." Aaliyah leaned against the table. "So how do we actually change things?" James sighed, rubbing his chin in thought. "It takes time. People don't wake up one morning and decide to see the world differently." Aaliyah exhaled, frustration creeping in. "So we're supposed to just wait?" James steadied her, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "No. We lead. And we don't just focus on the people who refuse to change, we invest in the ones who can." Aaliyah raised a brow. "What do you mean?" James gestured for her to follow him. They walked down the hall, past a series of offices, before stepping into a smaller conference room. Inside, a group of young professionals, mostly in their 20s, sat in front of laptops, engaged in discussion. "These," James said, nodding toward the group, "are your people." Aaliyah frowned. "Who are they?" "Future leaders," James said simply. "Young professionals from different backgrounds, different communities. They're part of our mentorship and management program." Aaliyah scanned the room. Some faces were black, some brown, some white. Some were dressed in sharp business attire, others more casually. But the energy in the room was different. There was passion here, a hunger for something bigger. "You want me to work with them?" she asked. James chuckled. "I want you to lead them." Aaliyah's brows lifted. "Dad." James held up a hand. "Hear me out. You said policies don't change people. You're right. But representation does. The people sitting in this room? They'll be the next managers, the next executives, the next decision makers. If we teach them now, they'll be the ones enforcing the changes tomorrow." Aaliyah looked back at the group. Could she do this? Could she step into a role of real leadership, not just reacting to injustice, but preventing it before it happened? She thought of Henry, the little boy who had spoken up for her on the plane, the way his mother had tried to silence him. She thought of Whitman, the way she had doubled down on her bias, convinced she was right until the moment she realized her boss was watching. She thought of the young black man on the flight, who had quietly endured an extra layer of scrutiny, just like she had. The truth was, this wasn't just about her. It never had been. Aaliyah straightened her shoulders, exhaling through her nose. She looked at her father and gave him a slow nod. "Okay," she said. "I'll do it." James smiled. "Good." Aaliyah turned back to the room, watching the young professionals working together, brainstorming ideas. This wasn't just about making sure people like her weren't denied seats in first class. This was about making sure they were the ones running the airline someday. And she was going to make sure of it. Aaliyah sat at her desk, scrolling through emails as her coffee cooled beside her. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind: meetings, policy revisions, strategy sessions. Every day, she was learning something new about the airline industry. She had grown up watching her father run the company, but now, seeing the inner workings from the ground level, she understood just how deep the issues ran. Change wasn't as simple as announcing a new initiative. It took time. It took constant effort. And most of all, it took people who cared enough to make it happen. Her inbox was filled with reports from the new training programs being rolled out across the airline. bias training for flight attendants, inclusive hiring workshops, customer equity review panels. The kind of things that would have sounded like corporate buzzwords just months ago, now they were real policies with real consequences. But there was one email that caught her attention. Subject: thank you. She clicked on it. Hi, Miss Carter. I don't know if you remember me, but my name is Henry. I was the kid on the plane. My mom doesn't know I'm writing this, but I wanted to say I think what you did was really brave. After the flight, I asked my mom why you weren't allowed to sit where you paid to sit. She said sometimes things just work that way, but that didn't make sense to me. So I looked it up. I read about how some people get treated unfairly just because of how they look, and I think that's wrong. I just wanted to tell you that I learned a lot that day, and I won't forget it. Henry. Aaliyah sat still for a moment, rereading the email. She had expected resistance in her new role. She had prepared for the hard conversations, the corporate pushback. But she hadn't expected this. A small moment. A young boy watching, listening, learning. It wasn't about changing everyone's mind. It was about reaching the people who were still willing to listen. Aaliyah smiled, her fingers hovering over the keyboard before she began typing back. Hi, Henry. Of course, I remember you. Thank you for your email, it means a lot to me. I'm really proud of you for asking questions and trying to understand things for yourself. That's how change starts. Keep learning. Keep speaking up when you see something that doesn't feel right. People like you make the world better. And if you ever need a seat in first class, I think I know someone who can help. Aaliyah. She hit send, leaning back in her chair. There was still so much work to do. But for the first time, she didn't feel like she was carrying the weight alone. Change was coming. And it was happening, one person at a time. Aaliyah stood outside the office building, the crisp evening air brushing against her skin. The sun had dipped below the skyline, leaving streaks of orange and purple across the sky. The world was moving forward, as it always did. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't just moving with it, she was shaping it. She had spent years trying to prove she belonged. In classrooms, in boardrooms, on airplanes, always being second-guessed, always expected to have an answer ready when someone questioned her presence. But now, she didn't need permission. She wasn't just taking a seat at the table. She was building the whole damn room. Her phone buzzed in her hand. A text from her father. James Carter, proud of you. Let's talk strategy tomorrow. She smiled. As she looked around the city, bustling with people heading home, chasing dreams, fighting their own silent battles, she realized something. This was never just about her seat in first class. It was about making sure that no one else had to fight for a seat they had already paid for. It was about making sure that someday, when another black woman stepped up to a first-class counter, the only thing the agent saw was a passenger, not a question mark. No hesitation. No verification. No extra layers of scrutiny. Just respect. She exhaled slowly, the weight on her chest finally lifting. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. And this time, she was the one writing it. The story of Aaliyah Carter is a powerful reminder that change doesn't happen by waiting, it happens when we take action. Throughout her journey, she faced unjust treatment not because of her abilities, but because of deep-seated biases that have existed for generations. Yet instead of backing down, she chose to stand tall, not just for herself, but for those who would come after her. This lesson resonates deeply, especially for older generations who have witnessed history unfold, from civil rights struggles to moments of hard-fought progress. It reminds us that our presence matters, our voices have power, and our actions can shape a better future. No matter how much experience we have or what stage of life we are in, we must continue to challenge unfair systems and uplift those who are still fighting to be seen. Just as Aaliyah refused to accept the way things are, we too must question outdated assumptions and advocate for fairness, whether in our communities, our families, or the institutions we interact with. Because real change isn't about one moment, it's about setting the stage for the next generation to walk forward with dignity and without barriers.